We keep saying we want innovation, creativity, collaboration, but most conversations are dominant-led, and whoever brings the idea to the table, that's the idea. So the CEO brings an idea. If you don't have a collaborative environment, whatever the CEO says, you go, oh, I guess we got to make that happen. So you need to be able to set the ground rule to say, hey, when we bring things to the table, they're discussed.
Who would you rather follow? Leaders who automatically defend their ideas, or leaders who are willing to discuss their ideas? I'm your host, Tim Spiker, and this is the Be Worth Following podcast, a production of the People Forward Network. On this show, we talk with exceptional leaders, thinkers, and researchers about what actually drives effective leadership across the globe and over time. You just heard from Steve Browne, Chief People Officer at Larosa's Pizzeria. Larosa's is not your average corner pizzeria. With 65 locations and 68 years in business, Larosa's is the hometown pizzeria for a multitude of communities. So what's their secret sauce? Well, Steve doesn't share any recipes during our conversation, but he does pull back the curtain on why he hears the phrase, "I love Larosa's" so often, both from customers and employees. For Steve, it comes down to the fact that he's in the people business. Pizza just happens to be the vehicle. In this episode, you'll get to hear how Steve prioritizes leveraging people's strengths. You'll also hear about a very unique practice at Larosa's called dumping your bucket. Finally, as we talk about Larosa's and Steve's role in the organization, you will hear that he is a leader that profoundly sees the employees within the organization as real live people, regardless of their age or position within the organization. Steve's others-focused mindset was influenced by people who modeled genuinely humble service to him. And that's where we begin. Who are some of the people that have influenced who you've become as a leader today?
I would say there are three over time. The first are my parents. And I know that may sound cliche, but I grew up in Midwestern America and a small town, and they modeled leadership themselves, both in how they lived in their occupations and in their community. So I had it around me all the time, and I saw how people looked to them and how they were others focused as people. So that was grounding. And then two of my bosses, one, Kathy Coleman, when I worked in an engineering firm, amazing to see somebody who was very intentional, talented, and brought organizations together because of who she was and what she did, and showed how you could do that seamlessly. So she could bring different disciplines together, different parts of the company together, and she had more of a business focus than anybody I've worked with going in. And then my current boss, who I had at Larosa's for 15 years, unfortunately he passed away, but he and I were tight, and he understood the value of being people first, and he showed it all the time.
What was his name?
Kevin Burrell. Kevin was fantastic. Every day he would come and say, "So Tim, how's your daughter?" And he would know everything about it. And he'd see you a month later and go, "Tim, you know that soccer game you said she was having?" And he would remember every single thing. And it didn't matter whether it was with our company stores or our franchise stores. He had a connection with almost everybody I saw, and it was genuine. And he, again, modeled how successful that was and really opened the door for who I could be as a leader.
I want to ask you a follow-up question about Kathy, because you mentioned that she was very business focused. Say a little bit more about that, because you also mentioned, well, it's about who she was. So I'm wondering about the marriage of those two ideas for somebody to be so high on your list of influencers in your own life.
She was somebody who came on to that company along with the founder. And so she started out as a support person for him administratively and in the operations side of things of a service organization, professional services organization. And yet she sat in rooms with very talented engineers, very talented architects, and they had talked very technically. You don't understand this and you don't understand this. And she says, "Oh, I do. And watch, this is how I understand it." And so she had a base knowledge of everything across the organization, and she would pull the strings together. So people who were technically very astute could do what they did, and she would make it fit within the organization. So I just loved how she kind of just pieced everything together.
I'm kind of bouncing around here between the people that you mentioned, but let's go back to your parents for a moment, because I will share with you that as we interview people for this podcast, parents are very often, not always, but very often on this list of the people who have really influenced positively how I lead today. Can you unpack a little bit more for us some of the examples that you saw from them that stick with you and help influence the way you lead?
My dad had a work ethic like no other, and he had grown up on a farm and then became the manager of the local grain elevator. And I never understood how dedicated he was, but he was up at dawn and going there so he could meet the farmers coming in from the fields. And he would work like crazy. And it's this very, very small town. He'd come home for lunch, and then he'd be home for dinner, and then he may go back in. And he did this for years. We were in awe of him. And it was just as a point of context, he did so well and knew all of the farmers around the surrounding counties. When I got my first job coming out of college, I called home and said, "Hey, I got hired, and oh my gosh, and you can't believe what they're going to pay me." And I had never heard of money like this in my life. And my mom pulled me aside and said, "Your dad has never earned that his entire career." And I'm like weeping. So he did all of this stuff to provide for our family, and we never, ever wanted for anything, yearned for anything, felt we didn't have what was needed to be a very tight family. And he also was on the city council or the village council for 32 years. And boy, he was just, every mayor was like, "Oh, Don." But my dad kind of held their feet to the fire for the common good of the community. And my mother was a teacher of secretaries back when it was called secretary for 30 plus years. And how I know she modeled it is her students would come back and say, "Mrs. Fleming, would you come to my wedding? Mrs. Fleming, I'm having a child. Mrs. Fleming, here are my kids. I just met them. And oh, by the way, I just went and worked here, and now I'm at this law firm, or I'm at this." And she was a part of their lives for decades after they finished high school with her. She taught in a vocational school. And she would always introduce herself. "Steve, this is my student, Mary. And this is what Mary does. And this is why I think Mary's so talented." And Mary would light up like a Christmas tree. When you have that as a pair of parents, it's hard not to soak it in.
Well, I just hear so much humble service in what you're sharing. And then I think with your mom's story, as you shared there, what an interesting barometer for the rest of us to learn from. I'm thinking about the leaders that I've worked for, and you think about those milestones in life, whether it be weddings or things going on with your kids or even a promotion at another company. And I don't think any of us reach back out to the crappy leaders that we've had to say, "Hey, I want to give you an update on what's going on in my life," right?
Very true.
It's like, you know what? Okay, I'm past that time of my life. I made it through your crappy leadership. I survived, and I'm going to survive in advance kind of mentality there. But if people are reaching back out and saying, "Hey, I've got some news," or "I got promoted," or "this really special thing happened with my kid," or whatever, it seems to me that would be a pretty good measuring stick. If we have made an indelible mark that was positive in somebody's life, if those things are showing up, we could probably say that was a pretty good leadership experience. What a special example. So we're not going to leave Kevin out. I want to come back to Kevin.
Kevin had grown up part of the family friends, very close to the Larosa family. And at the time he passed, he had just celebrated his 45th anniversary with us. And that's very typical of our company. So yeah, he knew the company from its early days to see, how we've become successful past that.
We're going to talk a little bit more about Larosas later on, but with Kevin in particular, you mentioned his attention to people. And, I think about some people who make it their mission to memorize names of spouses and kids and birthdays and pets and all that kind of stuff. But they do it as I'm just going to say, some people do that as a tactic. I want to give the impression that I care without necessarily having that deeper level of care. And my perspective on that, if somebody is doing that sort of thing as a technique and not genuinely, that we all kind of feel the lack of genuineness over time. But talk a little bit about that genuineness, because it's kind of like, I love methodologies like that when they're in the hands of a genuine person. So can you say a little bit more about that?
He was one of the most unassuming people I've ever worked with. I work with a ton of very unassuming people. He would walk into any of our restaurants and no one knew who he was as a title, but they knew him as Kevin. He would talk to team members and he knew team members, but anybody who was leading any of our locations, he knew intimately about them. It was not a tactic at all. In fact, it was kind of eerie how much he retained. But the thing that was nice was made him more approachable than others. You can't say people matter if you don't find out why they matter. And I think he showed that to me. I have been wired that way. So he and I together, it was just natural that we'd go in and say, hey, Tim, how's it going today? And we really want to know. And we weren't expecting the pat, oh my gosh, here's somebody from corporate. I need to tell them positive things. I want to hear how it's going. And it really opened the door. We heard more things than we probably could have or should have from people because they felt they could really talk to people instead of, it wasn't like a report card type thing. Hey, you're checking in so much, but you're not really checking in. And it also allowed him to, when difficult conversations had to happen, and they do, he had the bank account to say, hey, we need to have a tough conversation here. It was never derogatory. It was never demeaning, but he had the latitude to have those tough conversations when needed because he had built a relationship with them over time.
Time and again, when I hear stories about people who genuinely care about and build relationships with other people, this issue of difficult conversations comes up. And you mentioned the bank account, the old emotional bank account. And let's put ourselves on the other side of it for a second. If I'm working for you, Steve, and you walk into my office or catch me on the side and say, hey, we need to have a conversation. I know it's going to be a tough conversation. Isn't it interesting about how I come into that tough conversation if I know that you're for me? If I know you're for me and we're having a tough conversation, it's very different than if I think you're not for me as a person.
I think that's very accurate. And I think it's a successful way to do that. We all have a chance to improve. We all have a chance to have somebody point out our blind spots. And if you choose to have genuine, intentional conversations, you're not tearing people down. You're encouraging them. We're working through things together. You want to have something addressed so that it moves someone forward, not so that it addresses it. And even if it's, hey, if you correct this behavior, I know you're going to succeed, but I need you to correct this behavior. I think it works a lot better when people come just with, hey, we're going to smack you, Tim, because here's the 7 things you did wrong. Whack, 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 whack. All you remember is getting whacked. You don't remember anything that was said. There's supposed to be conversations. Whenever I see anything written about this, it's not written as much as acted upon with dialogue. It's a list. You need to read around the list. Here's what I know I need to cover. Boom, 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 boom. But how do I weave that into our conversation so that over our conversation, we get to talk about everything?
Well, let's fast forward now. We've got a chance to cover a little bit the people who have been most influential with you in terms of shaping you as a leader. Now, as you've gone on in your career, you have not only done the normal job stuff, but you've authored a couple of books. And then on top of that, you've had a strong presence in the national HR realm with SHRM. For those who might not be familiar with it, that is the premier National Association of Human Resource Professionals. And Steve, you've been very involved with them at a very high level. What was it that caused you to want to invest so heavily in something that was really, it's not like it was required. It was well outside the bounds of what you were being asked to do from a regular day-to-day standpoint.
It happened by mistake to start.
Okay.
Because I've been running an HR roundtable here in Cincinnati for 22 years. And it was affiliated with, and it still is affiliated with, the local SHRM chapter. But really, since I've been doing it so long, they're like, oh, that's the roundtable that Steve runs. But in one of the roundtables, I had never really been active in the local chapter. One of the roundtables, I jumped into the bad mouthing of the chapter like everybody else. Oh, it's just a bunch of vendors. Oh, it's just this. And one of the people who was active in the chapter, shorter than I am, I'm a tall person. So she came and she literally pinned me against the wall. And she said, look, if you're just going to tear things down, we don't need to hear from you. Now, if you want to make a difference, get involved or shut up.
Wow.
Fair. And it was just like, wow, right there at the end of the meeting. I was floored by it. I said, challenge accepted. So I went to the meeting and they had an opening, and I've never been somebody who has eased into things. It's a blind spot, but I'm like, if I'm in, I'm in. So I ran for vice president straight out. I had been to 2 meetings, ran for vice president. It was great. I ran unopposed. But when I got in, once I got in, the doors just opened and opened and opened. I never anticipated or wanted to do it in order to gain national acclaim or national exposure or national opportunities. But more and more doors kept opening. The thing that was great was being connected to my peers helped me do better in my work, because at the time I was in a department of one, which most HR people are, and you have no resources. You're so consumed by your work, you have to get connected to people outside of who you are. And I've always believed that networking is a business skill, not a job searching skill. You can use it for job searching, but if you don't have a good network, you and I wouldn't be having a conversation unless people had connected us. I mean, it's just a fact. So once I got involved, I'm an all-in type of person. So as other opportunities came up, I got connected to different areas. So I went from the local chapter to the state level and helped run the conference. And then they said, well, you should run the state. And I said, okay, I'll run the state. And then when I got to the state level, it was, hey, there's an opportunity to be over 10 states. And I went, okay, I'll give it a shot. So once I did that, then I got in front of the board of SHRM. That was part of the role, was to report about how the memberships were or weren't doing. And evidently how I presented myself at the board. The chair at the time, Brian Silva, great guy, just a great guy, said, hey, I think you should try and join this. And then when that happened, more and more and more doors opened. So I don't think it was, I know people who do this like, I'm going to make a name for myself. Back to my examples before, I'm not in this for me. And I don't know that there are as many people as I'd like to see that do local volunteering or local civic things or things through their church or stuff where it's about the mission of what you're doing, the efforts of what you're doing, the people who are involved. I bring people along. So that's what I've been doing.
Now, the episode that we just published was with a CEO from Capital Credit Union, Lori Butts. And Lori moved into her CEO and presidential role with the company from human resources, which I have never heard of. It seems to be an extremely rare thing that happens. And she and I talked a little bit about human resource leaders standardly not being seen as strategic in the executive suite. Talk a little bit about what it means to be in the seat that you are in and what you have seen nationally with regard to human resource leaders in the executive suite and how they are perceived or not perceived, because you're going to have a unique perspective on that, not only from your experience, but what you do with SHRM.
I think there's a couple sides to this. The first one is, for decades, HR has relegated itself to be on the outside of organizations. Part of it is the nature of what we do. So if you're in charge of regulatory work, compliance work, tying things together, you can't be really intertwined, people think, because then you're not objective, then you're not this neutral source. I buy that and I don't buy that. There's definitely value, and you should be that neutral place, that safe haven for people to come regardless of what level of employee you're working with. However, the mindset of a company and its leadership towards HR is the second factor. If the only reason people have HR is to do this regulatory compliance conformity thing, yeah, you're going to get what you get. And then when you say, well, they're not strategic, well, you're not even looking at them strategically, so stop it. So when you keep saying you're not, and the answer is, well, you're not expecting. There's two sides. When it's allowed, first of all, and I know that's a terrible word, but when people have the permission given to them in any of their jobs, especially in HR, if I'm given the door open, it's time for me to walk through the door. That's the difference. I don't know that a lot of HR executives or people in their roles feel that they can walk through that door. We've had this stupid catchphrase for 20 plus years of seat at the table. Stupid. Just freaking stupid. And the reason being is all you're trying to say is I want to be included. I want to show up. And I don't need an executive. Companies don't need an executive just to be present. You need to be contributing. So the third thing, though, that I think is a myth that we just need to blow up. Are HR people overhead? Yes. So are most white-collar positions. But we just take HR and go, oh my gosh, they don't do anything to earn money. Here's where the contrary ideal is. If I get people equipped and performing and developed, and they drive revenue, am I driving revenue? I think so. There's been several times where our family, who are great people, great leaders, say, hey, I was out at such and such a place and I heard that you were there and you talked well about our company and you represent our brand well. If I represent the brand well, is that an overhead cost that's a liability? Or is it an opportunity to say, here's a company that does well. I wonder what they do. I think I may work with them. HR people don't see themselves as having value, and they won't. It's self-fulfilling. I think you say, hey, because there are people in every department, a strong HR function will pull you together so that all the people succeed as much as possible to make us a better company. That's bottom line. That is bottom line thinking. Now, can I put a dollar figure to it? No. Can I talk about how I reduce liability by X amount of $1,000? Yes. It's a narrow perspective to say what we don't do. We're the only profession that gets this, by the way, Tim. We don't talk about if someone doesn't hit their quota in sales, we go, well, they didn't hit their numbers. Not they're a failed function within the organization. Marketing, hey, they were over budget by $10,000. Well, yeah, but that $10,000 was a good investment. And we justify. If we keep saying people are our number one reason to be everybody has it on the wall, they're our best asset, blah, 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 blah. But human resources isn't seen as part of that. That's a you thing. Sorry, it's not a me thing. So I think HR leaders can really lead in what they do.
What I would say to our senior executives, presidents, CEOs, COOs who are listening, I would challenge us all to think about, have we had that regulatory mentality around HR? I feel like many times the best way to describe human resources as they're typically viewed in the executive suite is keep us out of trouble, keep us out of jail, and keep out of our way. And I think that there's two sides to this coin, and you mentioned it. And if you take a CEO, president, or COO, if we are treating HR as they're not strategic, then we've got to own that. Now, I realize that many people listening might say, well, I'm looking at my head of HR and they're not strategic. So how can I treat them to be strategic if I'm not? But that's the other side of the coin. And you talked about open doors. To be able to challenge HR leaders in the executive suite to be thinking about the business side of how all of this works and their role in it. And you just described it wonderfully. and to say, well, if you open the door and you invite people to have a strategic view on their department as HR leaders, and then they don't step through it, then you get to have another conversation. What I share with our HR executives that are listening is we've got to be thinking about the whole business as, what's our contribution to it? It can't be just narrow. In other words, we've got to show up as strategic as well. And so I think there's responsibility on both sides of that.
I agree. And to support what you're saying, there's this long-held approach from HR people of know the business. Like, gee, can I read a P&L and do I understand it? That is so baseline and foundational. That's ridiculous. I think it's you need to be the business. And my job here is I get to be over all of the people and the people functions of Larosa's. But if we're not selling pizza, I don't have a job. So that isn't knowing the business, it's being the business. So what can I do to help our managers, to help their team members to do better so that people, when they make our food, it's a great experience for our guests. If you just know the trappings of business, that's not strategic. You have to be deep inside, and so should every other function, not just HR.
Sure, that's a good word. Well, it's also a good segue. So let's talk about Larosa's a little bit. Just to give people a little idea on the scope of Larosa's, talk a little bit about your footprint, you talk about the number of folks that you work for, locations, that type of thing.
We're unique when it comes to the restaurant business. We're celebrating our 68th year in business, and restaurants typically don't last nearly this long. We're kind of iconic here in the greater Cincinnati area. We are primarily in Southwest Ohio, Kentucky, Northern Kentucky, some more southern parts of Kentucky, and a little into Indiana. But we're regional, and we like being regional. We have 65 locations, and the majority of those are franchised. Great owners, great owner group. We have a really solid relationship. We call ourselves a family pizzeria, and the word family has all kind of connotations these days, both positive and challenging. But the thing is, I think we're about as descriptive of every facet of a family there is. But the thing that makes us distinguished, I think, or differentiates us from other places, I used to kid my boss, Kevin, all the time. And I said, if I hear someone say, I love Larosa's one more time, I'm going to scream. Because when people say we have to have a certain culture or hit certain benchmarks or hit certain things, when you talk to our team members, I am not kidding. If you met us, what do you like working about Larosa's? Oh, I love this place. What does that mean? And it means a ton of different things for different people. But it's very naturally part of who we are, part of the family that has founded and still very active in our business. We're different. And we have great food, ridiculously great food. We're the kind of place that my kids are now grown and moved away. And when they come back in town, first thing,
straight to Larosa's.
Hey, and when they say, let's get pizza, it's not, let's get pizza somewhere else. It's, we're going to Larosa's, aren't we? And you can't build that or just magically having that kind of brand equity. We worked really hard at it, and we're very proud of it.
68 years and 65 locations. There's probably a number of people listening who are leading organizations where you've got a number of different locations. Talk a little bit about the challenge that comes along with leading people, leading an organization, leading an enterprise that is not all under one building, because many organizations have that challenge, and they're trying to figure out, how do I propagate culture? How does the organization think about the development, leadership of the business when you're got so many different locations?
I think there's a couple of things that fall into that. The first thing is spending time intentionally in our locations. So we have a great infrastructure so that people aren't forgotten. We're in our locations on a regular basis because being visible makes a difference. Even if it's being visible just to check in to say hi, or if it's being visible because we have something more in depth to go through, or let's review how your business is doing, because we know that relationships drive business in what we do. It's a people-oriented business. We employ people, we serve people, we make food for people. It's people. Food happens to be the vehicle. So time is the first thing. And the second thing is having a good perspective on what are good metrics, what are good benchmarks, what are good production standards to have so that people can hit it. So we share that with our franchise group. We're very transparent, them with us and us with them. So we say, here's a good delivery times. Here's good food at the door times. Here's different quality standards. How are we doing on customer service and stuff like that? So there's so much out there. I never knew coming into the restaurant industry that it was a business. We're blind to this. When you and your family go out to eat, you want three things. You're greeted, it's welcoming, it's clean, and the food is good. But what it takes to get pepperoni and cheese and sauce from all these suppliers into a place so that there's dough, so that that comes to your table in a wonderful way. There are so many layers to the business of a restaurant, just like any other industry. But I think too often we look at the first surface, the touch point to the guest, and we assume that's the entire business. And that's just scratching the surface.
The restaurant business has amazed me from afar. And I say that because the consistency especially when you're talking about franchises, that part blows me away. The idea that all 65 of these locations would make, if it's a pepperoni pizza, and it tastes the same at each location. Like, I can't make 2 ham sandwiches taste the same, even out of the same bag of ham. It's amazing to me what goes into creating consistency in quality in the inner workings of your business.
It is fascinating. And that's one of a telltale sign, honestly. If you can go to different locations and do that taste test. And it's funny. When you work for a restaurant, Tim, you eat food differently. We had a new location open and I went out with my family and my family's like, do we have to go eat with you? Because I'll turn the pizza over and go, that's a good bake. They're like, you're the head of people. I'm like, look, that's a good bake. And I like the cheese really melted well on that.
You just said we need to know the whole business, right?
That's right. So I think because what's interesting is back to what you said earlier about strategic HR. If it matters how well that food comes out and I show that that has value to a 16-year-old who's choosing to work with us and I go, man, you're killing it. Look at this. Look at that pizza. Wow, that looks good. I bet that's going to taste so good for our guests. Thank you so much. This really matters what you do. That young person shines. They're like, look what I did. We can't keep treating those frontline tasks as if they don't matter, because at the front line, everything happens. When I see a host really greet somebody well, and I'm like, man, way to go. I was at one of our franchise locations, and they were getting their tail handed to them because we were busy. Now, think of that. Here we have people choosing to come eat with us. And I was with my wife, and she says, are you going to go help them? I said, I think I am. So I just grabbed some things and helped clear some tables and looked at some guests that looked a little frustrated. I said, hey, I know we're really busy. And I'm in shorts and sandals. They're like, who's this dude? And then I pulled the team members together and I said, hey, you guys are killing it. I know it's busy, but isn't that great? Think how fun this is that it's busy. And then the manager came out and said, hey, I really wish. I go, I'm not upset with you. I'm not upset with our situation. We're here as a team. I appreciate all that you're doing. I know it's tough. And she explained that she had this giant order in the back that she had to attend to. Well, she's doing her job. I think organizations miss this. I know I'm speaking just from my vantage point in restaurants. When you talk about leadership, I'm so past hey, it's more important for you to show up to work. I would rather have you come and perform. We keep looking at people as talent when we bring them in. We call it talent acquisition. Hilarious. But once they start in the company, they're not talented anymore. I'm tired of it.
Boy, that's true. Boy, you're so special before you get here. And then the moment you set foot in the building, all of a sudden you're seen almost as a problem in some ways.
So, I don't understand why aren't we talented all the time? And if we are, then let's work on that. Then let's look at our systems. Is that how we view people? Is it a talent-based system? Is it a strengths-based system? I heard somebody at a conference recently, Tim, just say this. Space systems work and they're sustainable. Deficit-based systems do not. The majority of companies look at people from a deficit-based lens.
If somebody were to say, define deficit-based lens, how would you articulate that?
Here's the classic. You sit down for a performance management review, which is an awful title, by the way. And in that review, the vast majority, I want to say 80% or more, is here's what you're not doing. Hey, you hit these marks. Way to go. Hey, hit your numbers. Because we get this myth of if I tell you everything that's wrong and they make up goals that we will not follow up on until we sit down again, that you're going to be this great employee going forward. So we all go through the motions. Managers go through the motions. Employees go through the motions, and nothing happens. I would rather sit down and say, here's what you do well. How can we leverage that even more? We just had a meeting this week between myself and the leadership of operations. And I gave the example. In the meeting, I said, Brian, because I don't do this well, I bring it to you. You kill it. You're so good at details. I am not a good detail person. When I give you stuff, it comes out and this is beautiful process. I appreciate you for what you do because I need somebody, our company needs somebody in what you do. And he says, you know what? I bring these things to you, Steve, because da-da-da-da-da. Now, we've worked on that. I mean, it's constant attention. If you keep saying you need to be a detail person and here's 4 goals and I want you to do these 7 to-do lists and let's follow the Covey method or whatever, I'm still not going to be that person. And yet that's how I'm measured. It's backwards. It's just really backwards thinking.
Well, and sometimes particular roles will require things like that. And if that's the case, then we need to get people into those positions that are wired in that same way. And the person who's not wired for that detail may be wired for something else, innovative, creative, engineering, who knows what else they can do. And they need to be moved into a different spot that values the way that they're wired more. There's a couple of things that you have helped to make sure are happening there at Larosa's that I want to talk about. So let's talk a little bit about Dump Your Buckets. It's a unique thing. And of course, it's got a great title. It makes us laugh even when we know what it is, which is probably a pretty good sign. So talk about what Dump Your Buckets means at Larosa's.
We went through a reset in 2021 after Kevin passed. And we started talking even more candidly than we have through the past. And Nick Larosa came in to say, you got to make it safe for people to dump their bucket. And I said, tell me what that means. He says, I got to be able to come in and say, hey, before we talk, I got to let things off. I got to get them off my chest. It needs to be safe that we talk about this. It's not a gossip fest. It's not a let's tear people down fest. It's we're out of line. I need to talk to you about this. And when we talked about that, he says, I really want that to be throughout the organization. So we'll go into conversations and say, hey, Tim, I know we're going to jump into this project. We're going to work on our menu design. But if you got a second, I got to dump my bucket. And we'll say it out loud. And people go, okay. And you kind of set the stage. Then people talk. But it's a safe way to have the conversation. So it's not just a bunch of chatter in the hall that continues to tear things apart. It gives you a better opportunity to set the stage and work through things. It builds credibility. It builds trust. It builds relationships. And the other big thing is something I've been working on here is I don't believe in silos anymore. I used to say, hey, look at all the silos in my organization. I was in a silo. It's just there. But my contention is this. If I spend time with you, the silos come down. If I build time with relationships, now I know more about you. I know more about what you do. I know more about how you contribute. I know where you're frustrated. So dumping your bucket's just healthy.
How do you keep it from becoming just a complaining session? What happens to make sure that dumping the buckets stays in the healthy and constructive space?
One, know that sometimes it won't.
So occasionally we'll get off the rails.
Occasionally you're like, whoa, this is bad. I met with our general managers for a while and I said, hey, tell you what, I know you guys have a tough job and I do, but all you do is come and start just griping about things. I said, so let's do this. Take 3 minutes and just let people go. Just let them lose their minds. See what happens. And one of my managers said, hey, I tried that. I couldn't stop them. He goes, cool. He goes, but the next meeting was so much better because we weren't clearing the air. And really, that's what you're trying to do. If someone comes across in a conversation where it's very pointed or it's very, I'm going to take a shot at somebody, we have the relationship to call that out. We will not call that out in the conversation, but I would pull you aside and say, hey, Tim, wow, that wasn't dumping your bucket. You were kind of coming at Steve. What's going on? And if someone's just a bully, and that happens, you got to pull them aside and say, hey, this is not what this is about at all. And work with them. I believe far more, Mike Larosa says this all the time, I'd rather coach you up than anything else. So whenever I come to them, I'm going to coach you up.
So in the midst of that, it seems to me that those pull-asides, when it goes off the rails, are really opportunities both for the individual and for the culture to be continually moving towards what do we really mean by dump your buckets.
And if it happens all the time, if every conversation you go, gosh, Steve, every freaking time you're dumping your bucket, I need to talk to you. Because if things are that bad, then let's have a different conversation. Too many organizations don't do that. We talk about them. We'll go, oh, every time I'm with Steve, rah, 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 rah. You go, have you told Steve that? Have we talked to Steve about that? No, oh, absolutely not. Absolutely not. So our thing is this. I would rather see you talk to people than about people.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's hard.
It takes courage to do that for most people, and it takes some level of skill to do that. But I think the thing that it takes more than anything for it to go well is it takes care. I think care probably takes care of about 80% of it. And then, maybe there is some skill and courage mixed in there as well. There is one other thing that you and I have talked about in a previous conversation that I want the folks out there to get a chance to hear. And that is this idea of what does it mean to discuss rather than defend? Talk a little bit about how you're trying to help the organization live in discussion rather than defensiveness and how you talk about that with them.
We have had some form of collaboration since we've been in business. The challenge is a lot of collaboration can happen in small pockets. And you can have a very few set of leaders say, well, we talked about it, therefore. And we did that. That was part of who we were. What we're trying to do, though, is expand that so that whenever there are conversations, there's collaboration. So if it's a small group and they're doing something more project-oriented or something specific, they should be collaborative, not single-focused or most dominant person or something like that. But you have to set the ground rule. So the ground rule is we're going to talk about a certain type of food. We're going to buy cheese from this new place. And I've done all the research and I did all the legwork. You have to put that pen on the table, as I mentioned before from lean manufacturing, put the pen on the table and say, what do you guys think about the cheese? And then understand, here come all the other voices.
Can you say just a little bit more about putting the pen on the table from lean for those that may not be familiar with it?
Sure. The idea is whenever I have an idea, or if I'm the person who generates the idea, or I'm bringing something forward, I can give the context of what it is, and then I put the pen on the table, literally, and step back, and then everybody can comment about the pen. And so they can say what they'd like. This is a very wonderful blue pen. And they go, well, is it blue? Is it chartreuse? Because it really looks not really blue. It's a light blue. So the whole idea is we keep saying we want innovation, creativity, collaboration, but most conversations are dominant-led, and whoever brings the idea to the table, that's the idea. Throw in that levels of the company. So the CEO brings an idea. If you don't have a collaborative environment, whatever the CEO says, what he or she says, you go, oh, I guess we got to make that happen. So you need to be able to set the ground rule to say, hey, when we bring things to the table, they're discussed. We had a great idea yesterday. The EVP of marketing brought in something he heard from a guest. And it was about a food product, so we all talked about it, and it was great. And to hear him do this in a room with all the rest of the executives was freeing. And then he took back all these information and these perspectives he never would have thought of or heard. And he didn't have to use any of them, but you heard them. And there are a few things he goes, oh, okay, so I think I'm going to go this way. Not, here's the solution. I think I'm going to take this approach. And everybody went, sounds like a good approach. It's healthy. But when people bring ideas and they instantly defend them, so you bring that first other perspective or the first contrary question or a first clarifying question, and somebody goes, don't you get it? Don't you understand this? I just had a conversation this week in a meeting, and I was trying to explain where I was coming from. And another person in the meeting started talking. And I said, I want you to let me finish my thought. And they looked at me like, what? I said, I do want to hear from you, but let me finish my thought. Because it was contrary to what they were saying. If you don't have that discuss versus defend expectation, it's just two people smacking each other. I think discussing works a lot better in order to move things forward, not for things to churn and churn and churn and churn and churn. Hear the different perspectives and bring things forward. If you want to be really candid, when I hear companies struggle with the issue of diversity, inclusion, belonging, things like this, the first thing I want to say is, how do you talk to each other? All the wonderful things that make us different as people, that's natural. But if I see that you really don't allow diverse thought, diverse perspectives, different viewpoints, I don't care what you say you have. You're not really fostering the beautiful parts of diversity that make us strong. It's more about weakness-based diversity, and that doesn't work.
And it's such an interesting thing about talking about this type of thing overtly. And what I mean by that is if you take dump your buckets or discuss versus defend, and this becomes language in the organization that people understand because you're bringing it up saying, hey, this is who we want to be. This is what it looks like. And then you take advantage of the opportunities both when it shows up and when it doesn't show up to point out either with a group or individually. I just imagine putting my idea that I've worked so hard on the table. I feel less threatened and therefore less likely to defend if I know that's what this time is for. That's what this conversation is for. Versus the time is for me to let you know what we're doing. And if you want to voice something, I'm just going to knock it down as quickly as I can. So what I hear you saying and what seems so wonderful to me organizationally is that we're going to have these ways of interacting with one another. And we're not just going to have them generally, but we're going to say out loud, dump your buckets. We're going to say out loud, we want to make sure that we're discussing rather than defending. Now you're packaging it. You're making it a thing so people can put their hands on it and actually do it. These ideas are simple, not easy, but simple. But I love the way that you are packaging them and talking about them overtly. I just think that's, frankly, I think that's so strategic. I think that is I really think it fosters, to something you spoke about earlier, a really collaborative and healthy environment.
It's an adventure, I tell you. We do it well most of the time, and I'm pretty happy with that.
So, Steve, I know that there's a myth within the organization that you have a little bit of a rock in your shoe about that you want to make sure, and it would apply to not just Larosas, it would apply to all of us. Tell us a little bit about that myth.
We have this idea that collaboration means stagnation. If I have to get everybody's ideas, we're just going to be stuck and we're not going to move. I think it's absolutely wrong. If you're stagnant, you're stagnant. If you're collaborative and it moves you forward, you'll beat the inertia that naturally slows you down. You just have to understand it takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of focus. But our term here is you should go home exhausted every day. And if you do, it's a good day. It's like, oh man, spent. That was good. That was a good day. That way we don't get so hung up on things. But I see too many people frame collaboration in a negative frame, when honestly I think it's a very healthy way to do work from a leadership perspective.
I feel like I say this at the end of every episode, but there were so many good things that Steve shared with us. It kind of makes it tough for me to narrow down to just a few to follow up on, but I will do that anyway. First of all, did you notice the theme? Those people that Steve identified as the most positively influential leaders in his life that influenced the way he leads today. when you look at the folks that he mentioned, there was a theme there, and that theme was humility and service, humble service. And so when we hear that effect on Steve's life, I just invite you to think about your own life. The leaders that have tremendous impact on the people around them, the best and most positive impact, they carry these qualities with them. And you heard, as Steve unwrapped those stories, the theme that carried throughout. Humble service is what made those leaders so influential and so effective. We also early on talked about the example set for him around getting to know people, knowing really who they are. And Steve said, you can't say that people matter if you don't know why they matter. Meaning that these folks matter significantly to their families and to their loved ones. They have responsibilities that they are fulfilling. They have things that they care about outside of the line of work, that we've got to get to know people. We've got to get to know their stories and their families. If we're going to say that people matter in this organization, then we need to know some about their whys. We need to understand, why do they matter in the midst of their lives? Who are the people that are counting on them? What's the relational ecosystem that each of the folks that we're leading is in? If we really value people, we should value and want to know those stories. The third thing that I want to make mention of here is the idea that Steve brought up, that we need to let people know that their work matters. He talked about the idea of looking at the underneath side of a pizza and seeing it done really well, and letting the 16-year-old who cooked the pizza know what a good job they had done and how important that is. This really taps into something that's critical for us as human beings, which is to say, it really applies to all of us, whether we're 16 or 76. Some of you may be familiar with Frederick Herzberg's work around motivational factors. His theory simply said that there are two sets of motivations. One are hygiene factors. Those are the things that can cause us to hate a job or hate a work environment. Hygiene factors can only get us from negative up to zero. But the things that really motivate us, that take us from zero to, I love this job, I love this place, and he called those factors the motivational factors. So hygiene factors and motivational factors. And the things that take us from, I'm neutral about this job and leader, to I love it, part of that has to do with achievement and recognition. And so what happens when we as leaders make that a priority for the people that we are leading, when we let them know that they've done a good job and that what they're doing contributes significantly to the value of what we're doing here as an organization, we are not only being good at connecting with humans, but we're also being very smart around the issue of motivation. It just makes sense that we would take the time to let people know, especially at the front lines, to let them know that what they are doing matters and why it matters. Finally, the thing that I want to end with here today is this idea of discuss rather than defend. We talked about the idea of taking a product or an idea. He used the example of a pen. I put a pen in the middle of the table. This is the pen that we've chosen, that I'm thinking that we're going to use. Now I put it on the table and I step back and everybody gives their 2 cents about it. This idea that if we're going to collaborate, if we're going to be playing best idea wins in our organization, then we have to have a place where we determine and chime in on and collaborate around what the best idea might be. And so this idea that we can put the idea or product in the center of the table and step back from it and acknowledge to everybody, now is the time to share any and all thoughts on this, including ones that might run in contradiction to us going this direction. It's really valuable for any of us to be able to do that. But I also want to point out how valuable it is when leaders do that. If you're at or near the top of your organization, and you are willing to put some of your ideas, the initiatives that you're leading, on the table in front of others, expressly for the purpose of discussing the validity of the idea, the features of the service, the concept of this new strategy or innovation, if we're willing to put those things on the table in front of others for the purpose of getting their feedback, we reduce our defensiveness. Not only are we going to be getting more refined and better ideas, but we are setting a great example for others in the organization. We're inviting them to do the same. We're inviting them not to be defensive about their ideas, but to be open to discussion about them. And what could be more valuable than setting that example so that that is happening throughout our organizations? So that leads me to the question I want to leave us with today, and that is this. As you think about your position as a leader and the ideas and initiatives that you are bringing forth to the organization, are you most often showing up as a leader who defends your ideas or one who is open to discussing your ideas? This is Tim Spiker reminding you to be worth following and to follow us wherever you receive your podcasts. If you've heard something valuable today, please share our podcast with your colleagues and friends. And if you're up for it, leave us a 5-star review. Thanks for listening.